thanks for all coming out. I appreciate it. We have done a number of these over the last, what, year and a half, where we have tried to discuss on a vigorous, but I think respectful basis, what is the role of religion in politics and government today? There's been a lot of discussion. Obviously, one of our major parties is going to nominate the first Mormon in the history of the country to run for president. I remember as a child when we had the first Catholic elected as president. And it just seems to me it's important for us to discuss these issues as best we can with a recognition of the history of our country in this regard. Because in my judgment, I have found that there's a lot of misinformation on this. Let me just give you an example of that. A couple of years ago, we were completing construction of the CVC, that's the Capitol Visitor Center. It's the largest single increase in the size of the Capitol, basically since the Capitol was built. It is now the entry point to our nation's capital by the public. And if you go there in the main hall, which we have now called Emancipation Hall, in recognition of the contribution to the building of the Capitol made by African Americans who were slaves. And as a tribute to them, it was named Emancipation Hall. But if you go in this large hall, you'll see a variety of statues. Sacagawea, famous Native American. King Kamehameha of Hawaii, representing the state of Hawaii. Jeanette Rankin, the first woman ever to serve in the House of Representatives. And even Philo Farnsworth of Utah. Does anybody know who he is? The father of television. So in many ways, these various symbols that are in our nation's capital and that we have moved to the CVC give us a sense of the history of America. But I thought that there was something that was lacking there, something that was lacking in the full representation of our patrimony. That is, you know, where we came from, how we got to where we are now. And that is that religious faith has been an ever-present fact in the history of this country. And there are those who want to dismiss that history. The failure to include it, in my judgment, is a failure to recognize history. It is a denial of history, and in effect, it compromises our understanding of where this country came from and where we are today. So it was for this reason, and because I had received the request by many other members of Congress that as the chairman of, well, I was the ranking member at the time, now chairman of the House Administration Committee, which has overall responsibility on the House side for the Capitol, that I thought that our national motto should be inscribed in the walls of this visitor center. And what is our national motto? In God we trust. This seemed to me to be a logical addition, and since it was engraved on the wall of the House of Representatives chamber above the rostrum of the Speaker, it seemed to me it ought not to be controversial. The thought that it was not controversial was a thought that didn't last very long. There were those who didn't understand that was our national motto. There were those who said because it didn't appear for the first time on a U.S. coin until 1864 during the Civil War, that somehow it wasn't something that was identified with this country for that period of time. It became the official motto of the United States in 1956. It is, in fact, found in the U.S. Code, codified as federal law. In case you want to look that up, it's 36 U.S.C. Section 302, and it provides specifically that in God we trust is the national motto. As soon as we announced that we were going to have it engraved, we were the subject of a lawsuit by an organization in Wisconsin that thought that this was inappropriate. In addition to my legislation that I drafted that was adopted joint resolution of the Congress, also stated that the Pledge of Allegiance, including the words under God, would also be engraved on the walls of the CVC. Now, the way it has worked out is as you come into the main entrance, across the large beam that is marble are the words, "In God We Trust." If you go down the stairs and go around and are going to go in the large auditorium, which is large enough for both the houses of Congress to meet at one time, as you go into that chamber, the words of our Pledge of Allegiance are inscribed there. I wanted it put there because I wanted members of Congress, as they were going in for a meeting, a classified briefing, a meeting of both houses, that we would see and be reminded of those words. The larger point is this: it is not the question of religious belief or non-belief. It is when they suggest that this ought not to be done or is inappropriate, it is the denial of our history, it is a rewriting of our history as it existed. I think this is something that makes us less worthy as a people. Because if you go back and look at history, it was not out of secularism, it was not out of materialism that we were inspired, that is, the founding fathers of this nation were inspired to create this nation. It was, in fact, the sense that we were going to create something larger than ourselves. You just have to go back to the Mayflower Compact. Signed aboard the Mayflower in 1620. In acknowledging divine providence, John Winthrop and the other Pilgrim signers expressed the desire to form a democratic form of government and a mutual regard for one another as equals in the sight of God. That's important because the concept of the equality of individuals came out of a belief that we were created by God. It's noteworthy that the remarks delivered by John Winthrop in a famous speech called The Model of Christian Charity paints a vivid picture of a potential promise available to those people through a covenantal relationship which resembled that of an earlier covenant people. In his sermon, Winthrop aspires to that city on a hill as it relates to the colony that he's founding in New England. Now, some of you may say, I didn't know John Winthrop said that, because Ronald Reagan said that. Ronald Reagan made reference to that any number of times, and I believe in his final address to the American people, talked about that shining city on a hill, which he had spoken of when he had lost in his attempt for the nomination, for the Republican nomination as President of the United States in 1976. Some of you may recall, it was Kansas City. Vice President Ford had been nominated, and the crowd assembled shouted for Ronald Reagan. And Vice President Ford invited him to come down to the podium. And if you recall, in an extemporaneous comments that he made, he talked about his vision of America being that shining city on a hill. It was a direct reference to what John Winthrop said. So you have to understand what that means. The Pilgrims, those who came to this country, wanted to establish something that was, in essence, a reflection of what they believed from Scripture. They thought that America was, yes, a place for them, but they really had great hopes that this country had a transcendent purpose. They really did view themselves as pilgrims to establish a new world. And that is really important for us to understand. The founding generation, following those pilgrims who had come 100 years or so before, had that same sense of purpose. John Adams, the author of the Massachusetts Constitution, a key player in the writing of our Declaration of Independence and President of the United States, understood this. He was committed to an early understanding, believe me, that the Hebrew metaphysic was the cornerstone of the new American culture. They made direct reference to that. Adams understood that only an intelligent, wise, and sovereign God could create and sustain the morality necessary to civilization itself. These are his words. He said, "We have no government armed with powers capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." What was he saying? That if we didn't have religion and morality, we could not, given our human nature, have a government that could actually allow a kind of society that we wanted. He said, "Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net." These are words of his that I'm always reminded of. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So he understood that the Constitution wasn't just a piece of paper or parchment. Rather, our nation's basic laws must be grounded in a moral order which embodies the timeless first principles of an older covenant. Now, it just wasn't Adams who said this. Think of what George Washington said in his farewell address. President Washington said this: "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity," in other words, of everything that adds up to a polity, a society that governs itself, that works, religion and morality are indispensable supports. He went on to say, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded by the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." Some people might call him an extremist today because they misunderstood what he was saying, and they misunderstand what he and our founding generation believed to be the cornerstone of that sense of individual worth and respect for one another that really is at the basis of our society of self-governance. These are the comments of a man who understood that the way he operated as president would set a precedent for the future. I think it was King George who said, when he heard that George Washington was going to give up the presidency, that is, not run for another term, he said, if that is true, he may be the greatest man in the world. I mean, think of that. Someone who was elected president but could have taken on the trappings of king, gave it up voluntarily. Now, today we're used to the fact that presidents have 2 terms. That wasn't the world order at the time. It was a tremendous example of the character of George Washington. He held that both reason and experience lead us to the conclusion that religion is the foundation for national morality. He extolled the method of practical reason as distinguished from that which we would call theoretical reasoning that some may have thought was part of the Enlightenment. In Washington's view, moral teaching was reliant on religion if for no other reason than the fact that in the United States, religion is more widely adhered to than any other philosophical source of ethical teaching. G.K. Chesterton once observed that America has the soul of a church. Washington understood that morality must ultimately rest upon transcendent source. Otherwise, there's little incentive to really act with what we would call character in private. Perhaps the most striking feature of Washington's address is the observation that religion is, as we say in the law, a condition precedent to national morality. You know, why did he think that? And why did the Founding Fathers also express that? Perhaps it's because they were looking at what was happening across the ocean. Perhaps it was because they were observing what was happening in France versus what happened in America. In the case of the French Revolution, the central motivating force was the secularization of French society. Unbridled, autonomous reason, absent from the check of objective moral constraints, proved to be insufficient for political organization. I don't think anybody could argue that the French Revolution was successful as the American Revolution was. There was a very, very different notion there. Those who led the French Revolution in 1789 under the banner of liberty, equality, and fraternity sought to destroy any competing philosophy which stood in its way. And in the end, the secular reign of terror concluded with the guillotine. By contrast, the American Revolution is rooted in an entirely different notion. The concept of liberty to which the founding generation aspired was rooted in this transcendent source. How do we know that? Well, look at the familiar words of the Declaration of Independence. They were understood to ring true throughout the generations of time. We all know those. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator, that's a capital C, by the way, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the source of these unalienable rights, where do they come from? It's clear in this document, it's clear in this declaration, that they're not the product of mere agreement. They are the product of the Creator. The significance of this is that if our rights do not ultimately come from man, they can't be taken away by man. I mean, you don't have to believe in religion. You don't have to believe in God to understand the power of that. That raises the individual to a level that was not understood at that time and around the world in terms of other governments. It is the ultimate fact of the transcendent source which gives rights their substance, not because we agree with those rights, not because the sovereign has given it to us, but because the Creator has given it to us. It is because each and every one of us obtain our rights from a common Creator that no one is entitled to preferential treatment under the law. We're equal because we're equal in the eyes of God. Now that, again, you don't have to believe in God to understand that's the underpinning of our history. And I would argue that if we try and deny that now, we are denying the underpinnings of our essential institutions, and we will be the lesser for it. Furthermore, because we're equal, no political institution created by other human beings has the right to deny us those rights which go to the heart of the concept of ordered liberty. I'm not talking about license. I'm talking about the liberty predicated on the nature of a Creator which has endowed us with such rights. Any effort by government to deny such rights would be plunder and lack legitimacy. So the construct that we have for our institutions that recognize our freedom are based on the fact that those institutions are to protect the rights that are already given to us rather than those institutions giving us those rights. That's an extraordinary difference. Now some say, wait a second, that's the Declaration of Independence, that's not the Constitution. I don't know if you've heard that argument before. That argument was one that was made during the Civil War, prior to the Civil War. As a matter of fact, it was made during the debates between Lincoln and Douglas. Abraham Lincoln, in one of his debates with Stephen Douglas, derisively stated, in response to contentions made by Douglas, that if the Declaration is not the truth, let us get out the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. He went on to say that the United States Code includes the Declaration of Independence as one of the organic laws upon which all statutory law rests. Lincoln argued, and I believe he had the best of the argument, that you can't understand the Constitution unless you are informed by the Declaration of Independence. Because the principles contained in the Constitution emanate from the propositions that are contained in the Declaration of Independence. Remember what he said on November 19th, 1863. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. See, Lincoln saw the Civil War as this fundamentally important struggle necessary for the promise of our Declaration. He understood that we had not carried out the promise of the Declaration, particularly for those who were enslaved. And he thought that it was a struggle to carry out the promise that this nation under God, as he said, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish. You see, I believe that's our history. That is truly our history. And our concepts of human dignity and equal justice before the law are deeply rooted in the notions of eternal justice. Now, you might say, well, that's an interesting observation you have, but is that truly reflective of our history? Most people would say, I think, that perhaps the greatest observer of America from abroad was Alex de Tocqueville, right? 1830s, he comes to the United States, a French aristocrat, to see what this whole nation is about. Here's what he said in his work, Democracy in America. Upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of our country was the first thing that struck my attention, and the longer I stayed there, the more I perceived the great political consequences resulting from this new state of things. He went on to say, religion in America takes no direct part in the government of society, separation of church and state, another way, but it must be regarded as the first of their political institutions, for it does not only impart a taste for freedom, it facilitates the use of it. Indeed, it is this same point of view that inhabitants of the United States themselves look upon religious belief. I do not know, he said, whether all Americans have a sincere faith in their religion, but I am certain that they hold it to be indispensable to the maintenance of their Republican institutions. His observation, coming to the United States, was that the religious foundations of this country were essential to the freedoms that we're seeing here. He concluded that the habits of the heart produced by religion encourage morality and a greater self-restraint among the citizenry, which lessened the need for more pervasive government. This is an interesting point, because another point that de Tocqueville makes in his works is that he found that in America, we were the most joining country in the world, meaning that we voluntarily joined associations, where in Europe, they thought you only got those things done by government. You Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Rotary Club, churches, who runs your Little League. I mean, think about that. Those are all non-governmental things that we call voluntary associations. Some sociologists call these mediating institutions, the institutions that stand between the individual and government. But he saw them as voluntary organizations. De Tocqueville concluded that the habits of the heart, as I said, produced by religion, encourage this morality. In his view, liberty and faith were intertwined. In other words, he thought that a virtuous society makes freedom possible. Remember the other words I quoted to you, John Adams, that our Constitution basically presupposes a virtuous and religious people that was insufficient for any other? That's sort of the backwards way of saying that a virtuous society makes freedom possible. In describing the influence of religion on American character, Tocqueville opined that it does direct mores, and by regulating domestic life, it helps to regulate the state. In short, both the religious institutions and religious life in America served as a countervailing force vis-a-vis the government, and thus served the interest of liberty as well as the sustenance of a moral order. So, the first and second great awakenings prior to the Revolutionary War, the anti-slavery movement surrounding the Civil War, are two examples of religious faith playing such an important role. Similar to the work of William Wilberforce in Britain to abolish the slave trade, our own civil rights movement was led by men of faith, and in our case, African-American pastors. One of the great pieces of modern literature, in my estimation, is Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. You got to realize he was put in jail, sitting there, denied access to books, sat and began writing this letter, and I am told that he began originally to write it on the margins of a newspaper they had available before they gave him writing paper. And if you read it, it is a magnificent statement. And in that letter, he said this. He said, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel, to practically every hamlet and city of the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond the Macedonian call for aid. This is probably the greatest leader of the civil rights movement. Clearly understanding the origins and nature of rights, he spoke of God-given rights. In describing the concept of rights, he wrote this, again, without access to any source materials. This is what he wrote. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just and there are unjust laws. And I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. So then he answered the question. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? This is what he said. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. This is the person who gave voice to the Civil Rights Revolution, who was a martyr to the Civil Rights Revolution, who is revered in this country as one of the great historical figures. And he is saying that the laws of man have to be, that is, if they're to be just, they have to square with the moral law or the law of God. Dr. King reasons from experience that rights must be rooted in a moral law that is itself rooted in the law of God. The expression of a majority is in itself an insufficient basis for rights. In other words, the argument by Stephen Douglas on behalf of the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which was the argument that the new states should be able to vote by majority as to whether they were slave or free, failed because of the moral premise that the majority sentiment should not overcome the fundamental first principle that it's not permissible to own another human being. The exercise of political will without moral justification is nothing more than the use of force legitimized by a vote. Douglas's position that such a question should be left to the decision of the various states was really an argument on behalf of cultural relativism. Lincoln understood that there was not a sufficient basis for law and argued, quote, there is no right to do a wrong, end quote. Rights that are not grounded in a transcendent being ultimately are left to the historical vagaries of taste and opinion. Now, I'm going to quote somebody that you would probably not believe would be on my side of the argument. Anybody remember the late Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas? Perhaps one of the most liberal justices ever to sit on the court. Douglas nonetheless observed that we are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being. Of course, not every American believes in God, and that's not what Justice Douglas was getting at. Rather, his focus was on our history as a people. It is undeniable that throughout our history, the religious faith of the American people in its various forms has been an integral part of who we are as a people. The plurality, the several different faith commitments we have come together in an American experience to form a canopy of overlapping consensus concerning the providential nature of our country. At the same time, I would say we ought to act with caution. We ought not to get too haughty about this. Any notions considering historical triumphalism or American exceptionalism, and I do believe in American exceptionalism, are ultimately tempered by a sense of realism that's also helped to shape the American character. Our founding generation had an honest and skeptical view of human nature, consistent with the biblical sense of fallenness. Look what Madison said in Federalist Papers 51. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. He's suggesting, of course, that men are not angels. He says, in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control itself. Madison and the founders were realists in the sense that they understood the human beings understood human beings as they were without the utopian dreams which lie at the heart of so many failed political experiments. So how did they respond to this? Did they ignore it? No, their constitutional response was to divide the powers of government, both through a doctrine of separation of powers, and then by constructing a system of federalism which would provide for dual sovereignties at both the national and state levels. Madison put it this way: ambition must be made to counteract ambition. If men are imperfect, if human beings are imperfect, how can imperfect people acting together create a perfect government? They can't. So how do you ensure that you minimize the opportunity for people to abuse the power of government? He said, they said, you basically put ambition against ambition. You put controls by virtue of the fact that you have a separation of powers. It's kind of interesting. I introduced Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia at an event about 2 years ago now. And he started out, well, in the meat of his speech, he started out by saying, what is it that is the best protection for freedom of Americans? And he said he would ask audiences, and someone would say the First Amendment. Others would say, in certain parts of this country, the Second Amendment. Others would say the Fifth Amendment. He said others would say the entire Bill of Rights. And he said that's not what gives us the greatest protection for our freedoms. He said it is the construct of government created by our founding fathers. Or he puts it this way, he says, particularly when he's talking to European audiences, they would say to him, now wait a minute. If you have a majority of people in the House of Representatives who are elected to represent all the people of the United States pass a bill, it doesn't become a law. And if you have a majority in the House to pass it and a majority in the Senate made up of 2 individuals from each state, they both pass it by majority, it still doesn't become a law. And if the president doesn't sign it, it still doesn't become a law. And if it goes back to the House of Representatives and they pass a measure to override the president by 2/3, it still doesn't become a law. You have to have both of them do it. And then he throws this out. He said, what is the British equivalent to our president? Prime Minister? But guess what the Prime Minister has to do? He has to be a sitting member of the legislative branch. It would be as if the president had to be a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate while he's president of the United States. In other words, no idea of the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branch. The conclusion that Justice Scalia comes to is that we established a construct of government that makes it difficult and inefficient on purpose so that it is difficult for government to pass a law which necessarily contains with it the power of the state to exercise control over it. Now think of that. It's not that government's bad, it's that by our human nature we are imperfect, and therefore we have to create mechanisms to ensure that we don't abuse that. It is an unbelievable thing that our founding fathers did to put this together. Madison and the founders were realists. They took us as human beings as we are. This is our history. This is who we are as a people. And although we're not captives of the past, nor would I suggest we should be, it would be nothing less than national suicide were we to fail to uphold the integrity of our collective story. And I don't think we should allow our story to be rewritten by those seeking to serve their own ends. For our understanding of our past serves to define who we are and to direct our aspirations for the future. The real issue here concerns a commitment to truth. The essentials of the institutions of our governance are spring out of an understanding of the divine, the Creator, granting us rights that we have because we are created by Him, not because we are given them at the sufferance of a sovereign. That was a revolutionary idea in 1776. It was a revolutionary idea when we established our country by way of our Constitution. In many ways, it is still a revolutionary idea today. And I think one of the worst things we could do for our children and grandchildren is to deny that history so that that understanding of the revolutionary notion of the worth of the individual were somehow lost. And so I just believe that as we discuss things in the contemporary political environment, as we say, what is the proper role of government? What is the proper role of the church? What is the proper role of one's individual conscience? We have to reflect back on the history of this nation and not make it up. I'll put it another way. Were Abraham Lincoln's words only good for his time? Were George Washington's words only good for that period of time? Were Martin Luther King's words only good for that time? I don't think so. I think there is a staying power. There is a essence of truth in what they say. And I think that we abuse history, but more than that, we deny our children and our grandchildren the benefits, the fruits of the labors of those who came before, if we don't understand it and work with it. Now, you can't just look to the past and say it's going to answer every question you have. But it does seem to me that we ought to get a bearing straight before we try and address some of these questions. And I would hope that in the current debate and the current decision-making, that our leaders would at least attempt to try and be faithful to our history. So, a few ideas. My wife, I know, has thought that I've read it too much. But I worked hard on it, sweetheart, so I'm going to read it. And I don't know, if anybody has any questions, observations, I'd love to hear them. Yes?
I've always been concerned in school. It seems like the school system is more concerned about, when you have separation of government and religion, or state religion, they're more concerned about protecting government from, or the school system from religion, as opposed to protecting religion. I mean, I think the original purpose was to protect religion from government. And so that I feel like
there are probably two purposes if you really look at it and remember the history of this country. One is, well, it says, the article, or amendment, First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which meant that the federal government would not establish a national religion. Although, interestingly enough, some of the states did have official religions at that time, and continued to have for some period of time. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And I think it's that second part that is often misunderstood. Prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We have a very interesting issue going on right now. This administration lost a 9-0 vote at the U.S. Supreme Court about 3 months ago. And that dealt with the question of whether the federal government could establish what the definition of ministry was. And they tried to suggest that ministry was confined to the concept of someone who was essentially carrying out very confined religious expressions to those who were already converted. And the court said basically you couldn't do that sort of thing. They were trying to say whether or not a church could establish certain criteria for people that would work for them. Now, it wasn't a minister, but it was someone acting in carrying out or in furtherance of what the church mission was. 9-0, they lost. We now have a big issue before us in terms of an order issued by the Department of Health and Human Services. And that is going to be determined in the courts. I think it's now 40 different institutions, including my alma mater, Notre Dame, has sued to say that it is a violation of the First Amendment to require them to participate in something which is contrary to their moral code as they understand it. So we are going to have a decision by the court as to what that part of the First Amendment means when it says that government cannot essentially abridge your practice of religion, prohibit the free exercise thereof. And, you know, by some rights, if you think about it, when Christ multiplied the loaves and the fishes, that wouldn't be considered a expression of his religious mission, because those folks weren't already converted and he was feeding them. He wasn't preaching to them. I mean, you start thinking about what the implications are. It's very, very important. And I think sometimes we don't think enough about it. And I remember a friend of mine in the Congress a number of years ago, Henry Hyde, once said, he says, I know a public official who is so tolerant of other people's views that he will not impose his most deeply held views on himself. Yes, sir.
I've heard the president on a number of occasions use the term freedom of worship, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at, where, and if you could speak to this probably much more eloquently than I can, it seems to me that freedom of worship is a really narrow band within the greater freedom of religion. For example, something that might be happening on the day of worship within the synagogue or the church. If you could maybe expand on that.
You're absolutely right. It's very important to see how carefully the language is used. If you take it, if you change it from freedom of religion, if you change it from the freedom to practice your religion, if you take it away from the idea of your free exercise of religion and you say it is your freedom to worship, you have confined it. Perhaps one of the best spokesmen on this is the person who is the author of the phrase separation of church and state, Thomas Jefferson. Remember, he wrote that to a group of ministers expressing or trying to allay their concerns about the government interfering with their religious practices. At the time of the Louisiana Purchase, New Orleans was part of the territory that was sold. New Orleans was, of course, a French territory, part of the French territory, predominantly Catholic. And at that time, the head of the Ursuline nuns in New Orleans wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson expressing their concerns that because the United States was taking over, that the Catholics, who were certainly a minority in the United States at the time, and the nuns particularly, would not be able to carry out their full mission. And I believe they ran a school, and they may have run a hospital, at least a school there. Thomas Jefferson, in a handwritten note to the Mother Superior of the Ursuline nuns, assured them that the federal government would never interfere with the practice of their religion or carrying out their mission. I've been informed that that letter still hangs in the convent for the nuns in New Orleans today. Now, that was Thomas Jefferson. I think he probably understood the Constitution as well as some of the people who are proclaiming certain regulations on the part of the federal government today. And I would rather have him in my corner. And I think that he would agree with you. Although he had an interesting view of some people of religion. He did express a belief in God and had great respect for those of different faiths. So I would use the letter of Thomas Jefferson as my best evidence as to the more expansive interpretation of the freedom of religion as opposed to this confine freedom of worship, where it's basically, are you in church, are you in synagogue, are you in mosque, are you praying at that moment? We're not going to interfere with it. But if you start to go outside that, somehow we have a right to interfere. All right, anybody else? Yes, sir.
Your reference to Thomas Jefferson brings a thought. When he wrote the original version of the Declaration of Independence, the largest single paragraph dealt with slavery. It was excised so it could be approved by the colonies. But I would love to have you speak to the idea that what he really did was he set in motion the mechanism that would allow slavery to be done away with in this country.
Well, I would say those that adopted the Declaration of Independence did. There are those who would criticize Thomas Jefferson as being less faithful to the dream than certainly George Washington, who freed his slaves upon his death. Thomas Jefferson did not. And so there are those, I mean, there are some writings of those people who dealt with Thomas Jefferson when he was in France, who were absolutely scandalized by the fact that when they visited in the United States, or it became clear in the United States that he held slaves, that they couldn't understand that contradiction. But there's no doubt in my mind that if you read the Declaration of Independence, it does state that all men are created equal. If you look at the Constitution, where it denied full census representation by those who are African American, that is misunderstood as believing that the authors of that section of the Constitution wanted blacks to be considered less than fully human. It was an effort on the part of those of the free states to minimize the representation that those in the slave states would have in the House of Representatives. Because if you counted the slaves as full numbers, then they would get larger representation in the House of Representatives. Kind of a strange flip on history, but if you understand what it is, you understand that. Lincoln absolutely believed that the war was God's punishment on this United States for its failure to be fully, to fully complete the promise of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, he basically said that this is something that was, that befell our nation because of our failure to do that. The price that we paid was the loss of life during the Civil War. If you want to really look at the price this country paid for that terrible notion of slavery. So I don't think there's any doubt. As Lincoln said, you have to, I mean, there was a big debate about that, whether the Declaration of Independence was something that, yeah, it was nice, it was something in the background, but it's not organic law. He truly believed that you had to understand the Constitution through the prism of the Declaration of Independence. And I think most of us would agree with that. So in that sense, yeah, the Declaration of Independence set the stage for the promise of freedom, which was not fully carried out until the Civil Rights Revolution, really. Yes, sir.
Mine's a little bit different. It goes along with the idea of your faith, holding on to your positions, with the political positions. And for me, one of my main ones is pro-life that I have. And my family, most of my family agrees with me on that as well. But we have people in our own family on both sides of the issue, just like you were talking about the country, how there's some people that want to take religion out of government and things like that. And one of the question I know, it's a little off topic, but I was wondering if you oppose with the pro-life, but do you oppose for the extreme cases of and the horrible cases of rape and incest? That's something that my family really has been debating lately, and if we should go all pro-life.
Well, you would hope at some point in time that people would understand the nature of life at the time one is in the womb. But I have understood that we are of such a state in our society that the terrible fact of rape and incest has always required that legislation that we've passed has included that as an exception. I think it was Thomas Aquinas who said something to the effect that you cannot commit a moral injustice by doing all that you can, even though that's not perfect. I mean, that's my rephrasing of his language. So I think in many cases we have to continue to argue for the worth of the individual, to recognize when life begins, and to attempt to protect it as much as possible, recognizing what the limits are in a democratic society in which we argue for our position as strongly as we can. I don't think you are morally deficient because you do the best you can under the circumstances while still arguing what the principles are involved. But here's where I do find difficulty. That is where people say that you cannot bring to bear on the public debate your beliefs that are grounded in your religious conviction. That is to suggest that the public square has to be vacated by those who have religious conviction. I would also argue that secularism or materialism or a philosophy of a view of life without reference to a God or a creator is in itself a philosophy or a form of thought that is in the square. And if it is allowed in the public square, then those people who are guided by their religious beliefs ought to also be in the public square. And I would further argue that the protection of individual thought and individual conscience is, in this country, rooted in a Judeo-Christian tradition which recognizes the worth of the individual as a result of the individual being created in the image and likeness of God. And so while one does not have to believe in God